Well, hello. Long time no talk. We've not done this in a while.
Yeah, it's been some years, I think.
I think I've had you on a couple of times before, but it's been a little while. But I've been following your work, and you do awesome work out there on Instagram. We're gonna just go ahead and jump right in. Lily Nichols is her name, you guys, and she's over on Instagram. Go check her out. Lily Nichols RDN. And yeah, you've been out there doing your thing for a little while. You came on my radar screen because you wrote a book about pregnancy and using real food. She's very much a fan of low carb diets, you guys. So I thought it'd be fun to bring you on this show today to kind of like see what you're up to now. You're a mom, you're an author, and just doing all the things that you're doing. So welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Jimmy.
Yeah. So I guess do an update on like what's been going on in your world. How has your, I guess, business life changed from maybe like 5-10 years ago when we were talking?
Yeah, I think I'm trying to remember when we last talked. It might have been when I only had one book.
I think
So
you had one book and maybe you were pregnant during one of the times. Anyway,
probably.
been too damn long.
So yeah, and I don't have my first book next to me right now, but I think we talked when I had released Real Food for Gestational Diabetes.
Yes.
So, and now since then, I've had have two kids now, and have another book, Real Food for Pregnancy. Real Food for Gestational Diabetes has gone on to actually shift public policy on gestational diabetes over in the Czech Republic.
Oh, really?
They completely changed their carbohydrate recommendations. So previously they were set at a minimum of 200 grams per day for pregnancy,
Yeah.
which is even more than the US. The US sets it at 175 grams. And they reversed it. So now they have a maximum cap of 200 grams of carbohydrates per day.
Wow.
And that came around from, I was tagged in a Twitter thread, and somehow my book ended up on a top doctor's desk in the Czech Republic who happened to have some clout in changing public policy. So now they're reporting, their rates of requiring medication and insulin in cases of gestational diabetes are down to like 10%. So that's huge because it's typically like 40, 50. I mean, I've heard in some endocrinology practices, I can't imagine what dietary advice they're giving out, but I've heard from some practices that it's 90%. And like, if you're doing anything where 90% of your clients require medication or insulin, then your dietary advice is not well matched to solve whatever issue, right? So
as an author, that has to be cool. I've written 9 books, and I've had a few that people say, it changed my life, but that's on an individual basis. You've changed the life of a country. Like that's got to go on like
it's pretty cool.
What?
It's pretty cool. I didn't expect any sort of policy changes from my work. I'd kind of given up on policy changes. Hopefully some, other countries and bigger countries will take note and also change their policy. But hey, it's great.
Well, and when it comes to gestational diabetes, which I know, and you often go on Instagram lives, I watch a lot of your lives. I'll pop in and kind of see what you're saying. You're really good at kind of the pithy answers to people's questions. You're very good at what you do, which is why I have always admired your work. But the thing about gestational diabetes is you're talking about a baby. And so people,
Right.
oh gosh, we don't want to do anything to harm the baby. And I'm thinking like so much of the things we do, especially for those mothers who have gestational diabetes, does more harm to the baby than if they just implemented some of the strategies that you've been talking about forever. And it's just unfortunate that they kind of fall into a lot of the traditional teaching of, well, we need to make sure the mom is getting at least 130 grams of carbohydrate in their diet just for their own brain health needs. And then on top of that, enough for the baby's needs. And so it becomes this morass based on a lie.
Essentially, yes. So, I mean, and it takes a lot to change people's, as my dad would call them, strongly held incorrect beliefs.
Yeah.
So what's interesting about it is, I would say, just working on from that one specific piece of dietary guideline advice that I found to be, non-evidence based and incorrect. This idea that you need 175 grams of carbs per day, and if you do less than that, you're going to enter into a state of ketosis, and that will harm baby's brain development, and yada yada yada. Like that, the whole purpose of writing Real Food for Gestational Diabetes was to debunk that. But since then, it really kind of opened up a can of worms on looking at so many other recommendations, and where did those recommendations come from? Where did they originate? What was the strength of the evidence used to set that recommendation? And particularly for pregnancy, because you run into difficulties with research and ethical dilemmas on what can you impose upon a woman who's pregnant, and not knowing the safety of, say, like a deprivation diet that's lacking in a specific nutrient, you're really limited. But we have had some changes in the way that they can do certain research studies, especially when it comes to protein is a good example, where we now have a method for analyzing the amino acid and protein requirements in pregnancy. And so the first ever study that did that directly in pregnancy was in 2015. And lo and behold, they way underestimated the protein requirements of pregnancy. Like for late pregnancy, the underestimate is 73%.
Whoa.
Okay, so huge. They need way more protein than any of the guidelines ever said. And I mean, if you look at it objectively, especially if you're somebody who eats real food, or if you've dabbled in low carb particularly, where most people tend to be eating a little more protein when you're eating low carb, you'll see that it's just ridiculously low, the recommendations. So
like, it makes sense though. You're trying to create a human being. And so why wouldn't you have more amino acid, the literal building blocks of our cells?
This stuff isn't rocket science. It's like, I feel like a lot of my work is, really digging into the nitty gritty of the research studies to prove what is otherwise obvious and common sense, but.
Well, what was obvious and common sense long ago? Long ago, we didn't have special interests that want to make sure mamas, use formula instead of breast milk, that make sure that they eat things that are supposed to keep their fat low artificially while eating this substance that's probably not doing them any good while they're pregnant. The hyperglycemic kind of spikes doesn't help the baby's health either. Like all of these things that used to be just how we did things, eating butter and feeding breast milk and all the things that we know are healthy. It's almost as like everything that's old, we got to make new again to bring people's attention to it.
Yep, I would agree with that. And, the hard part about it is you start digging into one nutrient and then you get into like, oh, well, now we have to debunk this nutritionism thing. We've demonized salt. We've demonized saturated fat. A lot of times we've demonized protein. Now we're demonizing meat for a variety of reasons. We've demonized eggs. We've demonized cholesterol. And so there's so much unpacking and undoing. I mean, you've been in this work for many, many years that it takes a lot sometimes to change people's minds. And then they still come back to those old, I mean, it's propagandized, right? So in our head, it's like, artery clogging saturated fat. It just sort of like rolls off the tongue, and you've heard it by the talking heads on TV for, year after year, and it's hard to undo that.
Healthy whole grains is another one.
Yep, heart healthy whole grains, absolutely. Heart healthy unsaturated fat. That's probably one of the worst misnomers. It's pretty wild.
I would say the worst one is healthy vegetable oils.
Yes. Or even calling them vegetable oils, which makes no sense. I remember even as a child going in the grocery store and being like, vegetable oil? Like, how did they get oil out of broccoli? They're not vegetable oils. They're industrially processed seed oils. It's like, why'd we call them vegetable? That was absolutely a marketing choice.
For one, exactly. They were very much marketing. If you called them seed oils, they sound a little more dastardly.
Yeah.
Like, you were one of those kind of kids that was very inquisitive early I didn't even pay attention. It was like corn oil. Okay, comes from corn. It's healthy. Good. Soybean oil kind of like skirted it, and definitely the one that blew my mind, cottonseed oil. It's like, why are we eating the oil out of cotton seeds?
Yeah, that's an odd one. Here's another funny one from the grocery store. As a kid, when the product said sugar-free, I thought you would get free sugar when you bought it. So I'd be like, Mom, let's get the sugar-free one so I can get the free. Like, I thought I'd be getting free sugar.
Oh, I think the weirdest label was like rapeseed oil. I'm like, what did they do to that seed?
That's an unfortunate name. Absolutely.
Canola made a little more sense, but anyway. So what is kind of the number one pushback you get when you start working with clients, ostensibly going through a pregnancy? And again, you guys, she has written a book all about real food and pregnancy called Real Food Pregnancy.
Yeah, Real Food for Pregnancy right here.
Show it on the screen.
Second book.
There it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, your second book. Yes, thank you. And so, tell us what's kind of been the pushback when you have promoted that and kind of try to help your clients going through it. Obviously, you've got a very hormonal woman that's kind of going, I'm scared, I don't want to hurt the baby, and how do I eat? And so then you say something and they give you pushback. What is that?
That's an interesting question, because I wouldn't say I get a whole lot of pushback, on the client level. And maybe it's just because people sort of like know the work, but
from your fellow dietitians then?
Fellow dietitians. Well, certainly, I mean, any of the nutritionisms that they personally believe, like saturated fat is bad for you. I think more and more as the agendas push for a plant-based diet, certainly that will have some pushback. People who strongly believe a vegetarian or vegan diet is appropriate for pregnancy. And I personally, at least for a vegan diet, strongly believe the opposite and have a very detailed non-emotional researched section on that in chapter 3 of Real Food for Pregnancy. There's certainly some pushback on that. And then perhaps my recommendations surrounding foods to avoid, or rather like not worry about avoiding, because I think so many enter pregnancy really concerned that
like what?
You just don't want to do anything wrong, and you're given often a list of foods to avoid, typically for food safety reasons. And I essentially debunk many of those, just looking at the relative risk of you actually getting sick from
Tell us
food.
some foods that you recommend and then don't recommend in that list.
Well, I mean, one of them that's on the conventional avoid list is eggs with runny yolks. And I personally feel like that is a very low risk food, given the data that the chances an egg contains salmonella is like anywhere from 1 in 12,000 to 1 in 30,000 eggs. So it's very rare that you're going to run into a salmonella issue.
Especially if it's a backyard chicken as well, that you harvest it, you know where it comes from.
In fact, I have an interesting statistic on that, because there was a study that looked at chickens raised organically, and their chances of those eggs containing salmonella was 7-fold lower than the chickens from conventional farms. You raise chickens, don't you? So you know this. I mean, chickens are made to I grew up with chickens too. So they're designed to just, roam around outside and peck and scratch and eat bugs and eat grasses. And yeah, they'll also eat, grains and other things that helps keep them laying and all that. But if they're not in confinement, they're not going to be harboring nasty bacteria in their GI tract. And the GI tract is the same one that the egg comes out from, right? So if you crowd a bunch of chickens into a factory farm and they're unhealthy and they don't have enough room and space to move around, they're going to have gut infections and you might have salmonella in your eggs. So eat better eggs.
Everywhere. So
everywhere.
I can imagine, there's a lot of shit back there now. I couldn't imagine if I had them in a confined, there's a main, I call Taj Mahal, area for them to live in, because it's bigger than a typical coop. Yeah. I take my babies, let's put it that way. But then they get out in the big grassy backyard, and it's ginormous for them to roam around, and they'll be all over the yard all day long, picking and eating and everything. Mm-hmm. And then I go in and sleep, and they got plenty of room to socially distance all night long. And yeah, it's beautiful. I don't ever worry about it. And I never put their eggs like in the refrigerator. I eat them hot, like room temperature. Like it's not all the kind of fears people have been inbred in us from our traditional thinking about food. Well, when you buy eggs in the grocery store, they're in the refrigerated section. You have to put them in the fridge. Well, you do, because they've already been washed and cleaned and all the things you do to eggs. So it's a different story when you start talking about real food.
It is. It absolutely is. I mean, there's so many examples of this. So suffice to say, I disagree with most of the foods to avoid lists in pregnancy, and I think it comes down to, sourcing your foods from quality sources as best as you can, and like just all the common food safety advice. Don't cross-contaminate. If things are from a questionable source, like don't eat it. In pregnancy, your nose is very attuned to off smells, and you will know if something is going to make you sick. Like you really know. I mean, say like deli meat, for example, and that's one where, again, it's actually fairly rare that you're going to have an issue with. The issue with deli meat is listeria. So it's actually pretty rare you're going to have an issue with listeria with deli meat. But I will tell you, in pregnancy, if I was having salami or something like that, I could have it on day like 1 and 2 after I opened the package. And then after that,
Too nasty.
inedible. I couldn't eat it. Like your nose is so attuned that you're just like, you have to trust your instincts too. And I think that's something that's kind of, there's a bit of a, paternalistic, we know better than you. And I disagree.
So you take the salami, honey, you can have the rest of the salami. I'm done.
Yep. I'm done with this package. It's all yours.
Oh, that's funny. There is this trend out there now, especially amongst like carnivore diet eaters. And I definitely want to ask about carnivore and pregnancy here in a minute, but of eating the meat more raw because you get more bioavailability of the nutrients. And of course, that would freak out a lot of traditional dietitians as well. Is that recommended, or you have any trepidation?
Well, I mean, that's certainly frowned upon in the conventional recommendations. I was able to find some like very specific statistics on like eggs and deli meat and soft cheese, sushi, but I wasn't able to find a lot of specifics on raw or undercooked meat. So I can't say from like a, relative risk of a pregnant woman getting sick from undercooked beef is XYZ. But I think it comes down to sourcing. If you're sourcing from healthy animals and it's been stored and handled with care, I'd be less concerned about you having, a rare steak than if you're just getting like, I don't know, any run-of-the-mill conventional factory farmed beef. I might be more like, that hamburger from that fast food restaurant, I'd probably opt for fully cooked if you're going to eat it, but if you're getting it from, a family farm down the road where the cows are raised on pasture and that they're, harvested, safely and the meat is cooled down soon enough and like processed in a facility that's really clean, then I would feel differently. So I think it's like anything. I think it just depends on the quality, and then also looking at the trade-offs. Like I've heard from some people, the only way they can eat steak, the only beef they want is like a rare steak, and otherwise they're not going to eat it, right? So you also have to look at what would be the nutritional trade-off if this person then goes on to eat no red meat whatsoever during their pregnancy because they're trying to avoid the rare steak. Well, if that's the only red meat you're getting and you're not also getting like organ meats or oysters or other things that would have a lot of iron in them or B12, then maybe you could be setting yourself up for some nutritional issues. So I think there's also, again, that sort of risk-benefit assessment you have to take on an individual basis for literally everything.
Yeah, and when I first started seeing people eat raw meat, I'm just like, the gut reaction of, ugh. But then you go, okay, but it makes sense, like that it would be more bioavailable. You're not cooking out the nutrients. I still haven't taken that dive yet, Lily. Sure, but
I saw a guy on Instagram eating an entire chicken raw, just like, you probably saw the same video. He was like ripping. I was like, I mean, for anyone who's listening who's been pregnant before, and particularly like if you can think back to, or if you're currently in the first trimester, there's something about raw meat and especially raw poultry that is just absolutely revolting. So I mean, I think that does sort of put you in a bit of a risky territory in terms of food safety. Again, if you're not 100% sure on the source, but secondly, I'm not sure many people would actually be able to do that in pregnancy because that is one of the biggest food aversions.
Well, yes, thank you for sharing that. But like even in the midst of pregnancy, it's always been traditionally in our culture kind of mocked of, oh, you want pickles and ice cream. And so like, how do you circumnavigate those kind of cravings that naturally pop up? And do you like let them have some better version of like a sweet salty?
So yes to both. I mean, sometimes the cravings and aversions show up for a very good reason. So with pickles, olives, other salty things, this is a nutritionism that needs to be debunked, right? That your body actually needs more salt, and especially more salt in pregnancy because you have more fluids in your body. And when you have more fluids, you need more electrolytes to go with them, right? So salt does not necessarily raise your blood pressure. It does not increase the risk of preeclampsia. And in fact, having adequate amounts of salt can reduce the risk of both of those, which surprises a lot of people. So absolutely, if you're craving salt, I believe you should be having the salt. The biggest thing with the salt is like, whoa, what is it coming along with, right? So if your cravings for salt is like pushing you to eat a bunch of like junk food and potato chips, then that's a different story than eating, olives or naturally fermented pickles or sharp cheddar cheese or something like that, right? Are you just getting a bunch of empty carbohydrates along with the salt? So that's something to think about for sure. And when it comes to other cravings, on some level, you can make a nutritional rationale for almost any craving, first of all. And I do, to your point, agree that you want to be trying to choose, the best possible food choice within that still satisfies that craving. So like an example of this, even for me personally, in like the nausea phase early on, I had this craving for sour gummy worms. And I remember being in the grocery store and actually looking at the sour gummy worm package, and it's like corn syrup, red dye number 40, green dye number whatever, like all the junk. And I was like, I just can't do it.
Wait. So the dietitian party you kicked in and the pregnant lady wants that thing.
I needed sour and sweet. So I was like, I can't do the junk. I just couldn't do it. I wasn't going to go there.
Yeah.
But I found that if I did dried tart cherries, it gave me the tart and the sweet.
Yeah.
And sure, that's like a high sugar food, right? And so I found that if I could just pair it with some salted cashews, I got the best of both worlds. I didn't get as extreme of a blood sugar spike because I was pairing it with something satiating, your cashews. I got the salty in there. I got the sour and sweet from the dried cherries. And so that was like a go-to snack when it was really tough to get any food down the hatch, right? And you have to sort of make the best of it.
You're making such an excellent point, Lily, of a lot of times we are drawn to those familiar foods that made us feel good or that we craved in our life, when there's always some real food alternative that if you get a little creative like you did, I would have never thought about red tart cherries. That's kind of brilliant. And then adding in the cashew, which is another fruit. Yeah, you got some carbs in there, but look at what the trade-off was. You got the carbs, but it wasn't all that junk, all that everything that would exacerbate your pregnancy. Yeah, you had a little spike in your blood sugar and insulin from that, but I would probably guess that by the next day, a lot of that had calmed back down again.
Well, what's actually interesting is I wore a CGM at different time points during the pregnancy to see what was going on. And, when you're like, for me, my nausea was like this sort of low-level queasiness. And what's interesting about that is you're just not able to eat a whole lot at one point. So my blood sugar patterns were actually like really, I mean, granted, I'm somebody with normal blood sugar metabolism, but my blood sugar patterns were pretty stable because you're not eating like half a bag of dried cherries because you can't keep that much food down. You're having
Right.
like 5 along with some cashews, and then like an hour goes by and your stomach kind of settles, and then you have something else, and then you feel a little queasy, and you're just kind of like, you eat like a bird a little bit in that early phase. And
Yeah.
so I actually almost got concerned for a bit because I was like, my blood sugar isn't spiking at all. I went ahead and had some juice to see if I could actually spike it, and I finally got it to go above 100. But your insulin sensitivity, if all systems are go, your insulin sensitivity is actually quite high in the first trimester, and your blood sugar naturally runs kind of low. So for me, it was like trying to stay above water just a little bit with the little snacks. But it didn't result in a spike, I think, because the quantity at one time wasn't very much. So it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, and you're making another great point that getting your body as insulin sensitive as you can possibly be before pregnancy will make it so that if you have to have those cravings where you come up with some kind of an alternative to the crap that you see and you dream about, and oh my gosh, I got to have, it doesn't really have the big effect that you think it might.
Yeah, absolutely. Not only that, but almost everyone, like 90%, are going to have some form of nausea or food aversions. And during that time, you're really reliant upon your body's nutrient stores more so than what you're eating. So if you do have the privilege of planning ahead for pregnancy, which not everyone does, so if you're in that early phase and listening, like, don't freak out. But if you do have the luxury of planning, then it really does pay off to have some of those nutrient stores built up, so you can at least have the reassurance in your mind, like, okay, I'm not eating the best and all the things that I thought I would be eating when I was pregnant, because everybody has this idea that they're going to eat like super healthy the whole time, and symptoms usually blindside you for at least a little while. And so at least you have that reassurance in the back of your mind that, okay, I prepared for this. I've been like taking my prenatal vitamin, I've been eating well, I've been building up my nutrient stores, and it's actually going to be okay.
Earlier, you mentioned about how there tends to be kind of, when there's cravings, kind of a salt deficiency, and that's what makes people kind of want the olives, the pickles, the potato chips. And isn't it funny, like salt is one of those basic minerals for the body for electrolyte balance, and yet we're told not to have it. It's almost like they want us to be out of an electrolyte balance. And same with saturated fat. They tell you don't eat that, but that's the very substance that provides satiety, where you can go many hours between meals and not feel shaky and not have hypoglycemia kick in and all these things. Like, it's almost like they're purposely trying to make people sick.
It would seem that way, wouldn't it? Absolutely. And the salt thing is so important because, especially for people listening who might be eating low carb, they probably know from listening to you and others, you lose more salt when you're low carb. I mean, when your insulin levels are at a nice, stable, low level, you just pee out more salt. And so you need to consume more. So that's definitely a shift for people. You know, on the salt note, I just want to mention, I recently was answering questions on my Instagram, and somebody asked about swelling and if there's anything you can do to prevent swelling. And so this one was interesting. I kind of was a little nervous answering because I don't want to give this sense of false hope that, you can avoid every possible uncomfortable pregnancy symptom or complication or whatever. Like, some things just happen. Not everything's within our control. I'm just about helping people stack the deck, right? So I answered the question and gave a couple tips on reducing swelling. And some of that was including adequate amounts of salt and electrolytes, and not going crazy overboard on the refined carbohydrates and sugar, among other things. And then I put up a poll and asked people, hey, if you followed my advice in pregnancy, did it reduce or prevent swelling for you? And 90% of people said yes, which really surprised me, because there's absolutely an expectation that you're just gonna be swollen and retain a lot of water in pregnancy. And I mean, some swelling, a little bit of it is going to be unavoidable, especially towards the very end. And if you're in a really hot climate, like I spent some time, I think I was right around my 3rd trimester in Texas, and it was so hot. I mean, I was a little swollen just because you're hot, you know? However, it never reached the point where I needed to like, you know, go up a shoe size or my wedding rings didn't fit or something like that. So it was definitely manageable. There was no pitting edema. I could still see my ankles, right? And so I found it really fascinating that so many people also had that same experience. And a couple people even said if I didn't eat enough salt or if I didn't take my electrolytes or whatever, my swelling would get a lot worse. And it's just very basic fluid balance stuff. But it's interesting that we've been told the opposite. We're just told you eat a lot of salt and you're going to blow up like a balloon. And the opposite is true. Your body just happily releases whatever extra sodium it doesn't need and maintains your fluid balance quite well. So hopefully that's reassuring for listeners that it's not, you know, you're not doomed to be super swollen in pregnancy. There is, at least it appears in 90% of cases, you can mitigate that somewhat.
Well, and it goes back to all the things we've ever been told. You need all these healthy carbohydrates to eat, and those carbohydrates make you hold on to water, and then the glycogen stores get filled in your muscles. And so then when you kind of even slightly reduce carbohydrates, you're going to dump a lot of those glycogen stores, which is why you pee a lot, which is why you don't have the swelling in your body near as much. So it's cool. By the way, when you were hot in Texas, did your husband say, honey, you so hot, girl?
Nice one, Jimmy.
Chance to compliment your girl. So awesome. Well, I guess the next kind of thing is when the baby's here, people don't realize this, that babies, when they're born, and please correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but
Yeah.
I've talked to a lot of people over the years, including a lot of neonatal kind of doctors and things, people like Mary Newport. I remember she said, people don't realize that when a baby is born, they're even like a little mildly ketotic when they come out. Like
Yes.
everything we do to try to prevent the baby from being in ketosis, they still come out in ketosis. And
They're
so
in ketosis.
not something to be feared by humans, because at the very moment you're entering the world, you're having this substance in your body.
Yes, and that's one of the points I try to make. We're so fearful about pregnant women going into ketosis, and yet it's basically unavoidable. It's just a physiological fact of especially late pregnancy that you are going to just be in and out of mild nutritional ketosis, whether you like it or not. Your provider probably isn't testing for it, but unless you have like gestational diabetes, and then they hound you to eat more carbs, right? But it is just a fact of life. And so if in fact their claim that ketosis in pregnancy is harmful to fetal brain development, then why would that suddenly like a switch flip, and when they're born and in the first 2 days of life, by the way, is when ketone levels are the absolute highest in a baby. Why would that suddenly not be harming their brain development? Because that is the physiological design. You are born, the umbilical cord is cut, that consistent supply of sugar goes away. Yes, they do typically start nursing, but they're not necessarily transferring a whole lot of breast milk early on. It's colostrum, and they're not getting huge volumes of it, and they are relying on their fat stores and their ability to mobilize their fat stores to keep them alive. This is why it's normal for babies to lose a bit of weight in the first week or so of life, and then they typically regain it as, you know, mother's mature breast milk comes in and you go transition from colostrum to mature milk. But they're still, even when you measure at a month old, babies are still in mild ketosis. So it is a fundamental part of our physiology and brain development. 30% of fetal brain energy needs are provided by ketones. So it's all just very silly that we're worried about it when it's like, it's unavoidable. Even if you eat a lot of carbs, you might keep yourself out of ketosis more often, but you're still going to dip into it overnight, whether you like it or not. Like, it's just, that's what happens. Sorry, friends. And if anything, it would be better to at least allow that process to happen by not shoving your system full of so many carbs, because then your baby is actually more adaptable to that relatively stressful period of, you know, the first 2 weeks of life where you're adjusting to being outside of the womb and getting used to nursing and having to work for your food and, you know, so It's very interesting how we've demonized something that's completely normal.
Oh yeah. And when I was born, by the way, I was 10 and 3/4 pounds. I was a big baby. So I think I came out of the womb ready to fast because I had so many fat stores to fuel me while my mom was building her breast milk
There you
cups.
go. Yeah.
Yeah, it was crazy too because that was the early 70s. And my mom, they would not induce at 9 months. It was late November and I was born December 27th. They would not induce her. They made me stay in another month. I'd never heard of
Wow.
take 10 months to get a pregnancy. And
So was she like 42, 43 weeks when you were born?
uh, yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
Yeah, so nowadays they probably would have been like
Oh,
inducing her at like 39 weeks. They'd probably do an ultrasound and say you're big and then
yeah,
induce. Maybe it's for the better.
yeah. All I know, I didn't get a vaginal birth, so I know that kind of screwed me when it came to like the microbiome. And then she was 300 plus pounds when she had me, so passed on. She probably had gestational diabetes.
Yeah,
Diabetes.
they didn't screen for it universally back then.
Right. So she passed on the insulin resistance kind of tendency to me. Thanks, Mom. But like, it's okay. I
Yep.
managed pretty well with my health despite the beginning of my
Yep.
life.
Yep, but I mean that is a legitimate thing and that's part of the work if you get into the numbers on it, part of why it's so important for moms to now that we have the information which we didn't have in the 70s to manage blood sugars, we know that there is a higher risk of that child later developing type 2 diabetes or becoming obese, and that risk threshold is anywhere from 6 to 19-fold higher. So, we're in a state just globally, really, but mostly in the US, where you look at the rates of childhood type 2 diabetes and it's like through the roof. I mean, how much of this can we really blame on poor food choices and inactivity? Like some of it is inborn in how our bodies were fueled in the womb and how our pancreas developed and our responsiveness to insulin, how much insulin we're producing. I mean, it's really fascinating research that we're finally getting more information about that we just simply didn't have in the 70s.
And something else we didn't have in the 70s is kind of like information from on high dictating how we're supposed to eat. But then along came 1980, we had the US Dietary Guidelines for Americans, which we just got the latest edition recently. And in the newest edition, Lily, I'm really interested in your thoughts on this. They had a lot to say about mothers and pregnancy and baby and how to properly eat. Can you kind of break down what your thoughts were on what they concluded?
To be honest, I have not looked at their newest pregnancy thing, which probably comes as a surprise, but
Yeah.
my world has been totally extremely
Oh,
busy right now.
yeah.
I did hear through the grapevine on the childhood part
Yeah.
about how they're recommending like eggs be a part of early childhood diets and sort of warning against strict vegan diets due to the importance of certain nutrients like choline for
Right.
early childhood brain development, and that's something that I is also super critical during pregnancy and breastfeeding as well. So I found that interesting. I've heard some complaints from people, in the plant-based community that is misguided and unfair. And I would invite them to actually do some nutrient analyses on a vegetarian or vegan meal plan for children, coupled with the reality of when you have young children, what are they actually going to eat? And like, if you can get down, 100 plus milligrams of choline in a single egg yolk, but in order to get that same amount, the kid is going to have to eat how many cups? Like, let's see, 2 full cups of cooked beans.
Ooh.
It's just not going to happen. It's just not. It's just not concentrated enough of a source of choline for it to really. A small child is not going to do that. Maybe an adult, although their choline needs would be higher. So, yeah, I'll have to take a look at the pregnancy ones. I don't think they drastically changed anything because I haven't heard from my colleagues that much was really different. So
Yeah.
we'll see.
It's definitely interesting. Please look it up. And I didn't mean to put you on the spot. By the 2 cups of beans, I don't want to be around that kid farting all day. Sorry, it's just going to happen. So, choline or not.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think, we're constantly having to circumnavigate all of the messaging out there. And one of the messaging out there over the past few years, as it relates to our diet and what kind of foods are available, are all these meatless meats that are out there. And I could see moms going, well, if I'm going to buy some kind of a meat product that's healthier, this is going to be a better option. So I know you've seen those out there. I tried for science, Lily, one of the meat burgers that smelled disgusting. It had like beet juice to mimic blood, and it was just and then all the junk they put in it, like 29 different ingredients, and whereas hamburger is beef, that's it.
Right.
What do you think about these things, and any mom that might be considering eating them during pregnancy or feeding them to their kids because they have to be healthier?
Yeah, so as you can guess, I mean, I'm not really a fan. When you look at the products, you can see just an exorbitant number of ingredients. They of course have those seed oils we were talking about earlier, so lots of inflammatory polyunsaturated fats. They're typically based on some blend of whatever plant proteins they want, but that's often like pea or soy protein. Unless they're sourcing organic, you're going to have a significant amount of pesticide residues in those because they're pretty highly sprayed when you look at, pea protein, soy protein, especially for glyphosate. And, I write about pesticides in Real Food for Pregnancy. I have a chapter on toxins, and it's pretty alarming, the potential negative effects of especially glyphosate, but also other pesticides on fetal health, on thyroid health in the mother, on brain development. So I'm not really a fan from that standpoint. And then the other thing that I would look at would be, what are the micronutrient levels? So I think we take a very interesting top-down approach to this, where we pick a nutrient that we want or a food we want, and then we try to mimic it, right? And sure, the plant protein burger, whatever, will have maybe equivalent amounts of protein to beef, turkey, chicken, take your pick of animal product. But what is the amino acid breakdown of that? Is it the same? So I recently had a post on my Instagram feed on non-essential amino acids. Those are actually, it's scientifically unproven that there's any such thing as non-essential amino acids. So there are specific amino acids, some of which we can only get in animal foods, that we aren't getting if we don't eat any animal foods, period. The second thing would be the micronutrients. So did they fortify the plant burger with vitamin B12? Did they add choline to it? Did they add heme iron? I heard there was some company that was trying to mimic heme iron and add it to their plant burgers. I don't know if they succeeded or not, or if that even works as well as heme iron. You're just not getting the full complement of micronutrients that you'd be getting in real food. And that's part of the benefit of eating meat. It's not just that you're getting protein, but you're getting fats in the forms and ratios your body likes. You're getting all of your amino acids, quote, essential, and the so-called non-essential ones as well. You're getting, ratios of different vitamins and minerals that your body can absorb and utilize. And we can't say the same for the plant foods. So again, I would argue that it would be better for you to source your meat from operations that are doing a good job, that are raising their animals on pasture and grass-based. Those farms have been shown to actually sequester carbon, not ruin the environment. I would say it's the opposite for the plant burgers. I think it's total greenwashing of the market. And if you really dig deep into this, watch Diana Rogers' film Sacred Cow, read her and Rob Wolf's book Sacred Cow for more on this. There's many other authors who've written on it. And you'll see that a lot of the arguments for going 100% plant-based, especially for environmental reasons, they don't hold up to scrutiny.
Do you find the average consumer is catching on to this? Like what you just articulated is brilliant. Like, yes, from a macro perspective, they pretty much matched what a burger would be. There's a little more carbs. It almost has to be with what they're putting in it.
Right.
But fat and protein identical in those just about. But like all the micronutrients, if they ran that Beyond Meat burger through Chronometer, for example, and they looked at all the breakdown of all the different nutrients and then broke down beef, it wouldn't even be close. Like even if they did
Right.
really fortify it, it's almost like what they've done with cereal. It's like, oh, we've stripped all of the good nutrients out of cereal, but then we fortify it with all these like fake chemical sprayed on vitamins. And like, is that an equivalency to what naturally occurs? So do you think people are catching on, or is this still the uphill battle?
I think it depends on the consumer. I think a lot of it is an uphill battle because the messaging is so strong and consistent in the media, and a lot of even nutrition resources. It seems to me a lot of the dietetics education even has shifted since I went to school and is really promoting this plant-based idea. I remember being a little, I wasn't nearly as much of I'm not a carnivore, but I eat meat, and I didn't eat nearly as much meat back then when I was going through school as I do now. And even back then, I remember thinking like, wow, this is really like, there's always meat in the meal plans. Like, why don't they do like a bean thing? Or why don't they do, now that has like changed a lot. And I think a lot of nutrition students are coming out of school really gung-ho about everything being plant-based. And a lot of it, I think, is coming very much from that environmental lens without an understanding of all the intricacies of how they actually like measure the greenhouse gases, how the cows are raised. Oh my God, you can go on and on with all the details about it.
Well,
so I think it's a mixed bag. I mean, certainly people who are drawn to my work seem to be pretty aware of that stuff already and are, not bought into that way of thinking. And then I think on more of like a general public level, it's hard for people to understand why you would have so many different organizations, both nationally and internationally, who are all coming together to the same conclusions, right? And I think it's especially confusing if you think about it and Sacred Cow touches on this a bit, but in countries where the economy is much more local and also heavily reliant on a local food supply, and you have like non-farmable land where like the only thing you can really raise is like ruminant animals and chickens and stuff. And that's often the way that people like make their living and trade resources. And in addition, their intake of animal foods is so low that nutrient deficiencies in B12 and all these other important nutrients is just through the roof. It especially doesn't make sense for them. And yet we're trying to like come into these countries and push our genetically modified corn and soy on them. I don't think people understand how deep the special interests go on that side of it.
Yeah, I got the opportunity about 5 years ago to speak in South Africa. They had a big low-carb, high-fat conference, and I was one of the speakers. And so at the end of the conference, Professor Tim Noakes was the one that put it on. He took us outside of the touristy Cape Town area into kind of the slum area, a couple miles outside of town. And it was so night and day, girl. Like literally it looked like a tropical paradise right there in Cape Town, all the visuals that people are used to seeing. And then right here was like how real people lived. And I remember they took us to this market where there were meat carcass body parts everywhere. Mm-hmm. Like literally they had them spread out. There was flies going all around them. This was basically the throwaway parts of the animal. But literally because of the socioeconomic situation they were in, that's all they could afford to eat. That's all they could afford to kind of barter for and get. And meanwhile, in the background in this area, Coca-Cola signs all around. And I asked Professor Noakes about that. He's like, oh yeah, they're housing and everything was just falling apart, and Coca-Cola came in and said, you let us put up these signs and sell Coca-Cola in the stores locally, we will fix up your houses and fix up the neighborhood. And that's what they did. And so there's kind of this trade-off that big corporations kind of see, that you can infiltrate even a poor country. They still got some money, and they're going to spend it on the junk because they're the ones that fixed our neighborhood. So we're going to buy Coke and drink it. It's no big deal.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you see this pattern repeated over and over again. It's pretty wild. So, and the farming, organizations come in with all of their big promises about you'll grow this genetically modified crop and increase your yields, and then the farmers can't keep their seeds. Like you can't keep doing things the way you were doing. It works well for the first season, then your soil's super depleted on nutrients, and then you're not growing the yields they said. And then you're beholden to purchasing the seeds from them every year and purchasing the chemicals from them every year. That was able to supply your family and part of your community is now inedible crop that's only really available for animal feed. And yet your animals can just eat whatever is growing out wild out back, right? It introduces this very unsustainable system of industrial agriculture, which is really what has destroyed the planet. But again, the greenwashing. So it's unfortunate.
Yeah, we could go deep with Monsanto and all the other kind of forces at play, kind of implementing all these things on us. But man, it's been way too long since I had you on. I definitely need to bring you back more often, 5 to 10 years. So
yeah, right.
Guys, again, Lily Nichols, go check her out over on Instagram, Lily Nichols. RDN, and those listening on the podcast, that's LILYNICHOLS RDN over on Instagram. And of course, your LilyNicholsRDN.com. You have a website with all kinds of tips for people going through pregnancy and having complications. And you, of course, see clients as well. Go check her out, you guys. Lily, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.